I appreciate Dr. Roldan Figueroa for hosting this series. Thank you, Dean Pak, for your support and leadership to help bring this important issue to light in our community. In this brief presentation, I want to explain what racial trauma comes up for me as a Japanese American, as a response to the rise of anti-Asian violence, so you can imagine a little bit about what it's like to be me. These are not simply current events of anti-Asian violence, as horrific as they are. They are reenactments for me of racial trauma that I have inherited and re-experienced and continue to experience. So as you know, we continue to live in the aftermath of the March 16th Atlanta spa murders, where 8 people were killed, including 6 women of Asian descent, and the alleged gunman was white. We're also living in the context of a year of nearly 3,800 incidents of anti-Asian hate tracked by Stop AAPI Hate. So when I heard about the Atlanta murders, my mind went immediately to my family's experience of danger when they returned from World War II camps. And what I'm referring to is the forced removal and incarceration of nearly 120,000 people of Japanese descent by the US government, 2/3 of whom were US citizens, like my parents, my grandmothers. My parents were 8 and 10 years old when they were released after spending 3 years behind barbed wire. So my mind went back to their experience of feeling in danger when they returned from camp. So just because the war was over, they were able to go back home, it didn't mean that the people back home necessarily welcomed them. In fact, there was a lot of open hostility. So in the small rural town that my mom came from, she suffered the daily indignities of riding the bus. And she was the first on the bus and the last one to get off the bus. And that whole time she would suffer being called yellow belly. So there was bullying going on at school. For the adults, it meant not being able to find work because people wouldn't hire them, or going to the store and white folks not being willing to sell to them, or being the last customer in the store to be served. My mother's family and extended family lived together for protection because someone's house, a Japanese American in the community, their house was burned down. Now, my father's experience was somewhat different, living in the city. He joined a youth gang. Now, this is my father, who was a pastor's kid, who at the time was the weapons guy who made homemade weapons for people in the gang. He showed me this like homemade billy club made from a weighted end with a spring that was bound with leather. And so I share with you some reflections on the past. At the time of this return from camp, there was hysteria and wartime racism still lingering. They looked like the enemy. And so Japanese Americans were easy scapegoats for white racism and violence. They were easy targets. There were few allies. There were not other Asian Americans standing with them, or others for that matter. And their invisibility was perhaps the hardest thing. There was no media coverage of the kind of violence that my parents suffered. The local newspaper in Sacramento, which was the largest newspaper of that area, was openly racist itself. And no one was tracking these incidents. It was the way things were, and it was simply ignored. And so I share these things to help you imagine that the past is not past, the past is also present. So mom is now 84 years old, and she's scared to walk in her neighborhood or to go shopping, because she's heard reports of elderly Asians being attacked, and she knows in her bones the fear of being assaulted. She has in her body memory the feeling of threat experienced in the post-war years. And me, I think of like, what are my chances of some unpleasant encounter when I'm out hiking, and almost everybody that I meet are white? Do I preemptively say hello or good morning in my clear American English as a kind of verbal strategy to protect myself? So it's not just my experience that I carry, it's my parents' experience, my grandparents' experience. Now, if you can imagine all of the other Asians that you see also having some visceral version of the racial trauma that they carry with them as they experience these current events. So if you're Chinese American, maybe your body mind goes to the 1871 massacre of 17 Chinese immigrants who were lynched in Los Angeles, or the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin, who was killed by auto plant workers in Michigan, who were angry at the dominance of Japanese imports. If you're Korean American, maybe your body mind goes to the 1992 Los Angeles riots when Korean businesses were burned by rioters. If you're Vietnamese or Cambodian American, maybe your body mind goes to the 1989 school shooting in Stockton, California, where 5 children of Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees were killed by gunmen who told a bystander, quote, "The damn Hindus and boat people own everything," unquote. Now, some reflections on now. I see some parallels between then and now. Certainly the scapegoating that's going on. Like in the current pandemic, people's anxiety and aggression find resonance in former President Trump's indelible images associating coronavirus and China that then get projected on anyone of Asian descent. It taps into this long-time racist social imaginary that treats Asians as a threat to be shunned and eliminated. And once again, perpetrators treat Asians as easy targets, preying on the elderly and mostly women in this case today. I'm also reminded of something that Catherine Moon calls foreignerism, which she describes as a mix of nativism and racism. And I see a kind of hysteria that's familiar, a prevalence of Asian American instance that makes me wonder how violence begets violence, as often happens in the phenomenon of copycat crimes. And then again, there is the invisibility. Now, I want to acknowledge that there has been some progress here. And so I say this as a kind of caveat. The response to the Atlanta spa murders has generated much needed discussion and media attention on racism against Asian Americans. So I've been really heartened by the kind of response that Dean Pak has made and our school has made that has given rise to this panel. There have been expressions of solidarity between and among individuals and groups across race to address the problem. And yet, I have to admit to a kind of cynicism too, because the current moment of attention to anti-Asian violence obscures a chronic pattern of ignoring racism against Asian Americans in general. And so think back to the historic events of anti-Asian violence that I referenced. How many of those had you not heard of or not heard much of before? And what concerns me is the normalization of anti-Asian violence. We all know that media attention is fleeting. And so there's a constant danger of reverting to the habit of ignoring anti-Asian violence, which is a form of privilege. And if you compare that with Asians who continue to live with and relive racial trauma in the midst of violence against them. And so an important question that I'll end with is, how do we resist individual and communal forgetting? And it can't be the next massacre to remind us. One thing that I think of a lot is the steps that we might take that go beyond just simply knowing about a subject, knowing about anti-Asian violence, but having relationships and deep enough relationships with Asian people that you begin to internalize the racism they know, or at least begin to. Thanks.